to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We are very pleased today to be joined by Kathleen Young, Karen Fediuk, Suzanne Johnson, Melanie Corinne, Megan Dark, and Daryl Johnny to talk to us about food insecurity through Indigenous perspectives. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding this circle. A gentle reminder for everybody participating today that sometimes the topics we cover can be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure you're looking after yourself. If you need to talk to a friend or an elder or a counselor or family member, please don't hesitate to do so. So we'll get the introductions out of the way quickly so we can dive into the content. We got a lot of it today. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chewatho First Nation, and I will be co-facilitating this session today. Other Learning Circle team members in the room but off camera are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Jordy, our assistant coordinator. I'm sure, as you can tell, there are a lot of different presenters today, so I'll just let them all introduce themselves as it comes to their time. Okay, so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kathleen, and you can get us started.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So excited to have you all join us, and for all our wonderful speakers to join us as well and share their knowledge with us. My name is Kathleen Young. I'm the Healthy Eating and Food Security Specialist at First Nations Health Authority. And just to give a bit of background and context of where this topic came about, was really as there's recent research coming up on the topics around food insecurity, we really wanted to bring that research in and also align it with First Nations Health Authority's holistic approaches and perspectives on health and wellness, and see how they can be aligned, maybe where there's areas of gaps or areas where there might be interest for further research. And we also thought it'd be really interesting to tie in the high-level, policy-level discussions around food insecurity and food security, as well as looking at some of the great work at the community and grassroots level, and bringing those two, all of those levels together, and having a good discussion around it. And having talked to many community members, First Nations members from across BC, really hearing from them the interconnections around food and what food means, and taking it at the technical terms of food insecurity and food security, but also bringing it back to looking at food from its connections to the lands and waters, the ability to access healthy lands and waters, as well as food's connection to culture and identity, food sovereignty, self-determination, as well as some of the challenges that communities are facing around chronic conditions, poverty, and mental wellness challenges as well. So I hope that we can have a really fruitful and great discussion with all our great speakers today, and I thank you for everyone's time. And I'm really grateful to be on the traditional territories of Musqueam territories, and I myself am based on Coast Salish territories, and originally from Saskatchewan, born and raised on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories. So
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie Corinne, and I'm a settler here of British ancestry. My parents both moved here from England in the 70s to start their families, so I feel very lucky to get to live here. And my role is I'm the provincial manager of food security with the BC Centre for Disease Control, part of the Provincial Health Services Authority, which is a bit of a mouthful. But I work really closely with the regional health authorities, with First Nations Health Authority, and with the Ministry of Health around trying to inform and influence practice and policy around food security in the province. And I'd just like to say, I'll be talking about some work that we've done around food insecurity here in what we call BC. And I just want to acknowledge and put it up front that I am by no means an expert in Indigenous food sovereignty or food security, and I'll let my colleagues on the webinar speak more to that. But I'm going to try and bring in a bit of this perspective that I've learned through working with colleagues and from what I've read. But it's definitely my interpretation, and I'm going to be sharing some of my learnings along my journey of talking about food insecurity. And some of those learnings have been as recent as, just a few months ago, working with some of my colleagues. So I will get started, and I'm going to try and shorten my presentation a little bit as I go, just to give more time for some of the other people on the call. And some of the stuff that I present, I think, will set things up for Suzanne and Karen's part of the presentation as well. So I put up quickly sort of the meaning of food here. Really, I think just I put some words that I've heard connected with it, both just through my work, and I did a master's in sociocultural studies, but also from hearing some of my Indigenous colleagues and communities, some of the words that they put. And I think it's just important to really understand that food really carries a lot of meaning. It's so important for health in such a holistic way, but it's part of who we are, and a number of other things. And I think that complexity and that importance of food is really important to acknowledge when we're talking about food insecurity or food security. I was going to give a brief story, but I think I'm going to leave the story out, and maybe I'll call it a quick synopsis. But my very first introduction to food insecurity, I'm a dietitian, and my first job was working with pregnant women here in Vancouver, and I really got to see how hard it was for people to be able to eat healthy when on a limited budget. And I just remember I worked with a number of the urban Aboriginal population in Vancouver, and I just remember one story always stuck out with me, because one of the women, she always prefaced when I asked her, how she'd been eating that week, that she couldn't afford the food and wasn't being able to feed her family what she wanted. And she came back from visiting her community, and, she told me about what she'd had, and she said, I've been eating a lot more salmon and willican grease and, and other traditional foods, and just how she spoke about it was, she was proud of what she was eating. She felt good about the food she was eating. She felt good about being able to share that with her family. And I think that story has just stuck with me over time. But and all of the people that I worked with who were struggling to be able to have the food that they needed has impacted my journey and my work that I've been doing for now 18 years. So just moving in, I thought I'd start a little bit with just defining some terms. We have a lot of different terms that get thrown around. So food security is often defined, people often use in the health sector, the Food and Agriculture Organization saying it's the physical, social, and economic access to food, and that's safe and meets preferences and dietary needs. So that I've just sort of adapted the definition to shorten it, but other people have brought in the definition to talk about environmental sustainability and the right to food, and that food is a basic human right, and that it needs to be accessed in dignified ways, it needs to be, culturally appropriate, and there needs to be those decisions. So there's a lot of definitions around food security, and some of them are more broad and comprehensive. Okay. And then the term food sovereignty is, and Suzanne will talk more about this, but food sovereignty is a movement that came out of South America, where peasant farmers were saying, the current food system does not reflect us. It doesn't reflect the political power imbalances or that connection to food. And so the Working Group on Indigenous Food Systems here in BC that Don Morrison's very involved with, I've talked about the 4 principles of Indigenous food sovereignty, and that's that food is sacred, that there needs to be participation in cultural harvesting, self-determination of the food system, and policy reform. And I think Suzanne will talk a lot more about that, but that's another term that I think is really important for us to be considering today. And then household food insecurity and how it's being defined right now in Canada, as well as here in BC, and I've sort of adopted this, is that one of the root causes is really inadequate or insecure access to food due to financial constraints. So that means that people don't have the financial needs. And it's not just the money, but they don't have savings and all of those pieces that go with it. However, some people would say that food insecurity is the opposite to food security. And in Canada, the researchers are really saying it's more the economic part of that. So I'm going to move into this conversation about some of the work that we've done around household food insecurity here, and what that looks like, and how maybe we need to adapt the definition. So so some of the work that we've done is we partnered with lead research in household food insecurity in Canada with Dr. Val Tarasuk from University of Toronto. And we looked at what's called Canadian Community Health Survey data, and they ask 18 questions around food security. And those questions are trying to identify whether people are food secure or food insecure, and they're really based on economic circumstances. So there's different levels of food insecurity. So there's marginal, where people are just worried about not having enough food. And in BC, we've said that is part of food insecurity. The rest of Canada, that's not necessarily part of the definition, but University of Toronto and other researchers are saying it needs to be, because we know there's health implications of just the stress of worrying about not having enough food. So that's marginal, and then there's moderate, where people are not able to eat the foods that they want. You know, the women that I worked with in that first job, they had to change what they were eating. They couldn't choose the foods that they wanted because they didn't have the money to do that. And then severe, often people think of it as the most severe, and that might be hunger. We use that term. And that's where people are maybe eating less, or they're skipping meals, or they're just not even able to eat during the day, and that's food insecurity. I just want to let you know that these definitions and this work happens across Canada. It does not happen on reserve. So the stats and the information I'm going to present do not include on reserve, but Karen is going to get into that, and Suzanne in the next part of the presentation.
Okay.
So what does food insecurity look like in our province? So 500,000 people in BC, or close to that, are food insecure. So that's 1 in 10 households. And we know that 1 in 6 children live in food insecure households. So it's not just adults who are food insecure, but children as well. And it varies. You can see how I've divided the province. That is not me. I did not divide the province that way, but that's how the health authorities are divided, and it varies within the health authorities as well. And this is based on data from 2012, 2013. We have new data from 2015 and 16, but it hasn't been analyzed in this way yet. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the some populations that have higher rates of food insecurity, and this is really because of inequities. So we know that people with children have higher rates of food insecurity in our province, and that single women with children under the age of 18 have rates of food insecurity that are 5 times higher than the couples without children, and it's 34%, so it's really high. And work that's been done across Canada shows the same trend for Indigenous women as well. So who in BC, of all the households that are food insecure, about 65% of them are employed. So they're working. So it means that either they're not getting the wages they need, or that their employment is precarious, it's on, it's off. And we know that about 15% of the people are on social assistance. But what we do know about people on social assistance is that 76% of the people on social assistance are food insecure. So that means the majority of people on social assistance are food insecure. So part of this survey, it asks people to self-identify their race. These are categories that are created through the Canadian Community Health Survey. We also know that Aboriginal people have about 3 times higher prevalence of household food insecurity compared to white or Asian people who identify as white or Asian. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this because this is about the social determinants of health, and I'm going to get into that in a couple slides. So the health implications, as I mentioned, this is, we talk about food insecurity as a social determinant of health, and a social determinant of health I'll talk about in the next slide. But it's really the health conditions, the social, economic, political, resource conditions that affect our health. And so we know that people who are food insecure have higher rates of chronic disease. They have a harder time managing their chronic diseases. They have higher rates of depression and feel more isolated from community. And we know that for children it's similar, so higher rates of chronic illness, harder time learning in school, and some work that's been done around Indigenous communities have found the same thing, similar health outcomes. So I just want to turn now to the definition a little bit. So we really are talking about economic. And so through some of my conversations and some of my reading and even conversations just with Suzanne before this piece, I presented earlier this year to a group of dietitians who work with Indigenous communities. And so some of the critique of this is that it's really focusing on the market foods, right? The income is really based on being able to buy the foods that you need. Some of the information I've read has also said, some of the research saying, well, that income can also help if people want to harvest traditional foods. It can give them some additional income to go and get the resources they need for that. But it's really based on the market food system. Whereas we also, when thinking about Indigenous communities, we need to think about that traditional food system, and so that often referred to as a parallel food system for Indigenous communities. So that's one of the pieces when we're only talking about income, and I think Suzanne will talk a little bit more about this in her session, so I won't spend too much time. Okay. But the next piece that because I've often talked about it as income-based, I wanted to talk a little bit about this web of being, which is a way that I'm trying to sort of make sense of it for myself, and I'm presenting it to all of you today to get feedback, input on it, but it's talking about the social determinants of Aboriginal people's health. And so Greenwood and Delau developed this for children, not for specific to food insecurity, but it really talks about the different determinants of health. And they start in the middle there, and those are called the proximal determinants. So as I mentioned, determinants of health are the social, economic, political, resource experiences that people have, and they're the inequities. And we know that these have the biggest impact on health. Probably about 50% of our health is determined by these determinants of health. So the proximal ones are the ones that are closest to us. And those ones, they say, probably have the largest impact, have the biggest impact on our immediate health. And then it moves out to the more distal ones. And at the distal end of things, they say those are the ones that are actually harder to change. And the middle ones are a bit easier. I'm going to put that in quotation, to change. But you can see some of the things there. They have income and food security. Some people would say food insecurity towards the inside. And then going out, you've got the environmental stewardship. You've got self-determination, land resources. These are some of the pieces of, the Indigenous food sovereignty principles. But you also have the context, the broader context of, of the other determinants around racism and colonialism and the residential schools that are impacting and have long-lasting impacts on health. Okay. So this is just a way that I'm trying to look at income as a piece of that, but you have to look at the bigger context and the broader determinants. So I'm going to try and wrap up. So when we look at some of the solutions, and I think I'm going to leave that to Suzanne to talk a little bit more about, but just to reflect on my own experience, one of the pieces of work that I've been doing is working with colleagues around developing a framework for measuring food security in our province and developing indicators. And through that process, we've recognized that this framework is not inclusive of Indigenous food sovereignty. And through my work, I worked really closely with Don Morrison to try and see how we could change things. And it really became clear that bringing in the principles of Indigenous food sovereignty is really important for when we're talking about all of food security as well as food insecurity. And so solutions, while income is important and necessary, I put the blackberries because I liked the different levels of them, and I know they're an indigenous food to where I live, and love blackberries, but that we need multi-pronged approaches that address the different levels and the different social determinants of health. And I think Suzanne's going to talk a little bit more about that. But we really look at the upstream approaches as well as, community-based, what people can do around the Indigenous food sovereignty piece. So I think I'm going to just leave it there, and thank everyone for joining us and for having me join you today. I would just like to really thank Cole and Kathleen for initiating the session, and I'd like to really thank some of the Indigenous mentors that I've had around this work, and that includes Dawn Morrison, who will be speaking in a couple of days, and Suzanne, who's on the call right now, and Nancy LaLiberte, who's a great colleague from the Indigenous health team at PHSA, where I work, and Karen Isaac, who is with the BC Aboriginal Child Care Society, and she and I have been working on looking at regulation around increasing access to traditional foods in child care settings and other settings. So I think I'll leave it there, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Awesome. So with that, we'll go into a little bit of a Q&A. 3 to 5 meals a day being an inadequate, is a very colonial definition of enough food. I think, again, going over those definitions of what is enough and what isn't enough, when we're talking about food insecurity, general question, are we talking about specific meals, or are we talking about calories per day? What are we talking about specifically?
I think, it's not measured on calories, like the way that it's measured in Canada, and is really to look at what, it's really questions, and I think Karen will get into this more in her session, but it's really, have you had to worry about being able to buy foods? Have you had to skip meals? So it's really based on their reflection. It doesn't say, have you been able to eat 5 meals today?
Okay.
So it's really up to their interpretation of the people answering the question as to how much they've been eating. So it's their self-analysis of, it's not asking calories, it's not doing anything like that, it's not doing a nutritional analysis, anything like that. And so so it's really people's perception.
Right. So this data is not saying this is what healthy looks like, and if you don't look like that, then you're not healthy. What it's saying is, do you feel like you're eating enough?
Around food insecurity, specific. There's other things around nutrition, but this is just around whether people feel food secure or not, and it's their own interpretation of the questions and how they want to answer them.
Okay, great. So with that, Kathleen, did you have any questions for Melanie specifically?
Well, maybe I'll just a quick question around the proof project that you mentioned that was done out of U of T, and they talk about having a fairly interdisciplinary team and approach. And I'm just wondering if you have any examples, and whether you do or not, that's totally fine, of like an interdisciplinary approach, as we've talked about. Just it touches on mental wellness, it touches on land rights and resources, it touches on just overall health, wellness, and nutrition. So I'm just wondering, within the province, are there any examples that you've seen at the policy level or other levels around that interdisciplinary approach, or using different interdisciplinary approaches?
I think there's definitely conversations around it, and I think it's something that's coming up, that need, and recognizing and seeing those questions and the, and the colonial approach to this and all of that. I think there's that need to have that greater interdisciplinary approach, and I think it's probably happening more at the community levels, to be honest, that we'll hear a bit more about from Suzanne and from Megan than what I can speak to at the higher level. But there's a recognition for sure.
And would you say then, are there possibilities, just knowing that there might be more up and coming researchers or students on the call, and that would there be opportunities, or even on your own interest or what you've seen in terms of gaps in terms of research and data information, Are there
Absolutely.
some hot topics?
Yeah, and I think, Kathleen, you and I have talked about this as we're working around sort of indicators, and that framework needs to be more inclusive in recognizing, the Indigenous perspective and that mental health piece and that capacity piece. So we're starting with that, and I think we've been working with researchers across the country, and there's been real interest in saying these are gaps that we don't know. We need to be working more on this, and so I'm hoping that work will maybe give us an opportunity to look more broadly at the issues, and without just looking at sort of healthy eating, even though that's where we come from, but really looking into the mental health, and Indigenous well-being in all of those areas, and being more holistic in our approach.
Awesome.
Great.
Thank you.
So with that, we're going to move over to Karen and Suzanne.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Suzanne, I'm going to let you start, please.
Let you start.
Please.
Well, okay.
Putting you on the spot.
You are putting me on the spot. You told me I was going to meet you. No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you to the UBC Learning Circle. Thank you to the First Nations Health Authority for inviting us to participate in this session. And thank you to everyone who's checked in online for this webinar. My name is Suzanne Johnson. I am a member of the Penticton Band, and I have been working as a dietitian within First Nations communities for over 20 years. I've taken a bit of a break from the work that I do in the communities, and I've gone back to school exploring a food security, food sovereignty issue that's really exciting and really hopeful within my own territory, within the Socio-economic Nation. And I think this opportunity for us to talk about food security is really great timing. The need has always been there, but it's really coming. And I think just in the spirit of what has been in motion for several years in terms of reconciliation, in terms of bringing people together to really to talk about the issues that we face and how we can move forward together on that path. The climate within BC, just in what has happened as far as climate change and the impacts of that, we see that there's definitely a need to be coming together and to be talking about these issues. So I hope that the audience is broad, and that I know the chat line can be quite active. So I hope that this is really informing and encouraging and enlightening for everyone. And so with this presentation, we wanted to start out with we've been I guess fortunate within the past 10 years to finally get some information as far as what that does describe the concerns within with respect to nutrition, with respect to food security, particularly for on reserve. It's always an area where there's a lack of information and a lack of data, and I think sometimes that lack of information can be used as an excuse not to do things. So Karen's going to go in and start off the presentation reviewing some of this work that's been part of national work that was endorsed and supported by both the Assembly of First Nations as well as First Nations Inuit Health. So do you want to take it up? And from there I'll follow with some of the starting to tie in hopefully what some of the questions are that have been on the chat line, and some of the pieces around what our movements forward for Indigenous food sovereignty could be.
Great. Thanks.
Sorry, that was long.
No, that was perfect. Thanks, Suzanne, for sort of opening this session. My name is Karen Fediuk, and I am a third-generation settler. My great-grandparents moved to Manitoba from Ukraine, and then my father, looking for work outside of farming, moved to Vancouver area, and so I was born on Coast Salish territory, and spent my early years living in the Lower Mainland. I went to UBC, did a degree in dietetics, and similar to Melanie, my first job was working in a Canada prenatal nutrition program in Mission. And I became more aware of, as Melanie's story was similar, so my experiences were similar, dealing with food insecurity, and learning a lot from the people that I worked with. I chose to go back to school at the Center for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Environment at McGill University. And so since for about 20 years, I have been involved in research related to traditional food systems and contaminants. And so today, part of the discussion is we'll be sharing with you some of the work that came out of the First Nations Food, Nutrition, and Environment Study. And so I'm just going to see if I can, yeah. So as Melanie said, a lot of the definitions around food security come out of this earlier definition. I forgot to say I'm in the traditional territory of Stalatin First Nation right now, sort of west of what we know as, or what we sometimes call Prince George area. So my internet, I've just set it back, but it may be a little bit wonky today. So I was talking about my training as a dietitian, and I've worked on the First Nations Food, Nutrition, and Environment Study. My other hat that I sometimes wear is I work for the Firelight Group, which is a consulting group that primarily works to provide technical support to Indigenous communities across Canada. So, I'm out in the field this week doing some various research with communities. So to talk about this definition of the definition of household food security often focuses on the economic access to food. But we recognize, that this doesn't, and as described by Suzanne, Melanie, and others, this doesn't really fit. It goes far beyond, as mentioned earlier, in terms of that Indigenous food sovereignty definition that came up. It's really talking about the stewardship of the land, the ability to manage the land, and have control over what's happening on the land, how it's being used to make sure that it's sustainable. And so it's having that full access to that really takes us into the next step of what food security, food sovereignty is for many people. And really right now, we often frame it in terms of when we compare it, we're talking about, sort of the physical effects on health, but there's all the other mental and I'm going to present to you quickly now some of the information from the First Nations Food, Nutrition, and Environment. It came about because there was conversation and recognizing that there is a lot of changing Indigenous foods across what I call Canada for ease of speaking, and that there are so many different threats, whether it be contaminants and climate change and the habitat loss and huge industrial development and increased urban development in various areas that formerly were used quite well and sustainably by people. Our goals under the First Nations Food, Nutrition, and Environment Study is to take a look across Canada of what kinds of people are able to access and are currently eating. What is the diet like? What contaminants are in traditional foods? What also contaminants are in water? Are there pharmaceuticals entering the waterway? Animals, different plants gathered for medicinal purposes are being used. And ultimately, what is the diet like, and how well are people able to feed their families from the traditional and the market food system? Over the of 10 years, our goal was to go what we call region by region, and we did a systematic. We use the Assembly of First Nation regions to guide us in the work, and we also use the secondary ecozone level information It's really understanding that the different types of wildlife and plants vary by the region that you're located in, different cultural practices. So we randomly selected communities based on the region that they were located in. And this is just information for you of who are the various people that are involved. We have that we call the primary investigators are Dr. Laurie Chan, who's a toxicologist at University of Ottawa, Dr. Tonio Fediuk, who is at some First Nations, and he has sort of the portfolio of the environment. Dr. Malik Batal at University of Montreal, who's a nutritionist. And then we have some support from Indigenous Services Canada, who assist us with the water and the hair sampling for mercury levels. And the reason we're doing that is it's another way to kind of check in traditional foods that may be entering people's bodies. And then, of course, in the center, we have participating First Nations communities who are asked on a yearly basis if they were interested in participating in the study with us, and we would take a lead. So we did this study in the Assembly of First Nations regions of British Columbia back in 2008, 2009. And this is just a map showing the communities that participated at the time. So we had overall 21 communities participate in eco zones. For your information for the Learning Circle, we are basically preparing a final report. And so it'll look, as we prepared regional reports across, they have sort of the information sort of be aggregated up at the Assembly. But we're preparing a national report, and it'll kind of provide information from across Canada, but also at these unique ecozone levels. And as you can see in BC, of course, this is the only place where there's we call the Pacific Maritime Cordillera, and the Boreal Cordillera as well is really primarily just in northern British Columbia and then up into the Yukon area. And then the Taiga Plain in the eastern, where Fort Nelson is, and Prophet River extends a little bit into the area of Alberta. And then we have the last one in from BC and across. And so you'll see, or what we're seeing is that there are different kinds of traditional food that are used depending on the ecozone that people are residing in. And also the amounts that people are accessing change with the levels. I won't be presenting that specific kind of information today, but just to give you a heads up that that's what will be in there. I mentioned earlier, there are many different components of the FNF-NIA study. Food security clearly plays a major role in this. It comes in through the household questionnaire, which is really about diet, perceptions of health, what are your current harvesting, what is being harvested, what percentage of households are participating in harvesting, and then the food security questions we ask around the traditional food supply, how secure it is, and then we also ask the 18 questionnaire that Melanie referred to earlier in her presentation, which really speaks to how well do you feel that you're able to afford the foods that you need to feed your family. Would you consider this a healthy or well-balanced? It's sort of like broad questions. Are you usually able to feed your family? Are there any shortages that are happening in the last month? So there's a number of different questions, and they talk about, are there times when adults meals to feed the parents, to feed the children. And then, so that goes into that. And then you can see, I've just mentioned that there are other components of the study. Now, these reports are available online because there will be all various sections that I won't be discussing today, but they're available at www.fnfmes.ca, and that information can be shared with you later. But it's a general website. There's also a Facebook page if you're interested. So, and moving forward, this slide just gives you a sense of the different AFN regions that have participated in the timeline and then were involved. So overall, we had approximately 6,500 households. And just to give you a sense of household food harvesting practices, this is presenting from British Columbia. So at the time that we did our study, 20% of households said that they were participating in hunting practices. 37% said that they were fishing, 33% said that they were collecting berries and plants, and 25% of households in British Columbia were planting a garden. This changes you're in. This is just at the overall, the larger regional level, but it changes at the ecozone level that you're in. So in some areas, there's going to be greater levels of fishing or hunting or gardening. That's just to give you a sense of what is happening or what was happening at the time, which is 10 years ago now. So there's quite a high active participation. This slide really just represents how often people across our adults across BC were currently or in 2008-09 having some of the key traditional foods that were more readily available. And these were, of course, like the foods more commonly eaten were moose, salmon, and deer. And as you can see that they were at that time, even then, they were some families were on a basis or multiple days a week. But when we looked out over all of the people that were participating in the study, this is what I call the average amounts or the average frequency that these foods are appearing in the diet. What we also found out across the AFN regions is that always the majority of households wanted to have more traditional food in their diet. And we clumped these up. I clumped these into barriers of the household that I'm kind of categorizing myself. It was really like the chief driver force was that people were talking at the household level, recognizing that the immediate thing was the income, which is a real driver of if people are able to get out further than where they used to get in. Most people can't just harvest near where their reserve lands or the traditional part of their traditional territory is that they're sitting on reserve. It's because there's so much development around their reserves or there's private land, but they have to go further out to get what they need, and that is a real driver for the need for income. There's also a lot of households that mentioned that they didn't have a certain type of, maybe they didn't have a hunter or a fisher, so they needed different family members, or that was a barrier for them to getting out. And seeing many people who said, they at the time when we were doing the survey, they didn't have the depth. Far the bigger barriers are the external barriers, and people spoke to this about there are government restrictions and regulations which have changed harvesting practices over time. I was talking with some people who were in their 40s and 50s, and they're saying, well, things have changed a lot since we were kids. When we were kids, we could just go out. We were expected to go out, get fish, or go hunting. But today it's much harder with licensing, limited age, or being of a higher age, 18 or 19, before you get a firearms license. And much more importantly is climate change. Where I am right now, people have just gone through a devastating 2 years of major forest fires in their area, and that has totally changed the landscape. So that comes speaking to how to climate change. And there is very limited accessible high quality areas for harvesting in around many communities. Moving into the results from what Melanie presented earlier, a little bit about how is income food security and how is it impacting people. I'm presenting to you here what we were finding from the communities that participated with us in this study on reserve lands. And as you can see, it's a very extreme picture that we had in British Columbia. When I add in the marginal level, which is really the worry level about not being able to provide food for your family, it goes up to 50%, or 1 out of 2 households that we participated with us were insecure. And when we looked at this earlier, and I just talk, I want published in 2010 or 11 for British Columbia, it talks about like 41% food insecure. And that really reflects those two. Melanie spoke to defining there's 3 levels of moderate and severe. And so what was presented in that report when we published it at the time was really the moderate and severe. So people that were changing or changing the types of food that they were buying at the store, purchasing what we call maybe lower quality foods or no name brands, or we're going without food, which is like a severe form of food insecurity. And that's about 41% of households. Again, very high, 2 out of 5 households. But here we have, you've got 50% basically. And so you can see the patterns across Canada among Indigenous populations, among First Nations living on reserve lands. It's very, very high. This is really a reflection of the income differences. And I will present another slide really shortly to talk about another way of seeing those large income differences. I wanted to talk about, I know there's a Canada Food Guide. I'm using it as a simple way. I acknowledge it doesn't represent Indigenous traditional food patterns, that the past or the preferred dietary patterns. I'm just using it as a frame to kind of look at the comparisons of what we call the diet and what people are eating on a daily basis, and this feeds into the food insecurity aspect. So as part of the FNFNES, we actually got people to what are all the things that you ate and drank yesterday? And we looked at that on what that meant in terms of food servings and compared it to the Canada Food Guide, because it was an easy way for us to see, like, are people able to meet at least these really basic rudimentary needs as mentioned by the Canada's Food Guide. And then we also looked at it at the nutrient level. What are the kinds of nutrients that are inadequate or adequate? So you can see from this slide that basically adults at the time of we were doing this were not able to meet any of the Canada's Food Guide. And frankly, most Canadians don't. But food insecure, it's really hard, especially to access a lot of vegetables and fruits, which tend to be a lot more expensive. And this slide is to show you and illustrate, we looked at when we were eating, and when we came and looked at the nutrient levels, we could see that whenever traditional food was appearing in the diet, you had a greater likelihood of getting to or meeting some of the needs of several different kinds of nutrients that are really critical for good health, including protein and zinc and iron, and is really primarily driven by the presence of salmon in the diet. And then on days when only market foods were eaten, you tended to have just lower nutrient intakes and higher levels of saturated fat and sodium, because a lot of people are relying on some of the very processed foods, because of course it makes sense when you're when you can't necessarily choose. You're relying on more some of the processed foods to get you through the day. And you can see here, I've highlighted as well, what overall in British Columbia, we're talking about 80 grams of traditional food was being eaten on average. For some community members, that would be closer to 200 grams, but 79 grams is that small little piece that sort of you can imagine. But that amount of traditional food is really like this really extremely rich form of that important piece in the diet that provides so many key nutrients for good health. Overall, what is the diet quality like on reserve in British Columbia and across many of the Assembly First Nation regions? It's generally, especially of traditional meats in the diet, it's usually adequate in terms of iron and a couple of the other small micronutrients such as riboflavin and niacin. but it's generally inadequate in a lot of berries, fruits, and vegetables. Vitamin A and D, again, the D from fish largely, and calcium and magnesium, and vitamin C. It tends to be, like for all Canadians, tends to be more than adequate in terms of salt and saturated fat. For a comparison, for everyone to kind of see what are some of the differences. So I mentioned that the diet tends to be these days limited in terms of the vitamin A and sometimes inadequate. And you can look here, and of course you can see this is some of the work that has been done by people such as Harriet Kuline and Nancy Turner, getting support from various community members to provide different traditional foods. You have here really traditional foods, rich source of the micronutrients such as vitamin A. And this really speaks to, Suzanne is going to get into this a lot more than myself, but we can see that how drastically changed, and we can imagine very quickly that when you had just over, well, almost 200 years ago, when people formerly had probably a gram or more of salmon in their diet or salmon to use on a daily basis, things were very different in terms of what those other health outcomes would be. And it's changed drastically. And just presenting this slide, I wanted to kind of take a stab. I had, this was done for some of the work that I was doing with the Firelight Group, actually, to just to present take the stats from the last two censuses to separate out First Nations population from the total population, and then separate it out more, First Nations living on and off reserve. And I've just presented to you a couple of the key things. That's called the low income measure after tax, Stats Canada, and I put that in there very much for you to know that that's a user defined. That means that I specifically requested them to do this. Stats Canada normally does not do this for Indigenous peoples or First Nations in Canada living on reserve, because they say that there's not enough that they know about the barter and trade economy and how that figures in and plays into people's income levels. But very interesting, and I did that. I think it lines up very well that overall First Nations people are very much. And you can see from this bottom row that in 2011, 49% of households on reserve would be classified as low income. And Stats Canada has these definitions of what low income is, but it's usually like almost the square root of the median income. And so you can see like the median income would be around, and it's divided up based on the number of people that are living in your home. Income is really about 54,000 for a family, and it would be like below half of that. What is the percentage of families that are living below half of that? So about 24,000 to 25,000. So you can imagine that for First Nations families living on reserve in 2011, about half of those households are living below $25,000. And so this lines up, as you saw, if you remember that slide that I showed earlier about those families that said that they were 40% as well. And you can see from 2016 that things haven't really changed. So I'm going to just walk this over and give this over. Suzanne's taking over now. Thank you.
So moving into, the question, I guess the approach, the approach of colonial governments is, sometimes to find a single solution or to find a single focal point in which to address issues. And so the focal point of income has been brought forward in professional circles, as well as I think the government, just in far as, there's been major advocacy for a set minimum income. There's been major advocacy to improve these situations that have been described in Karen's portion of the presentation. And I think the question is really, how will an income solution to food insecurity ensure the ability of Indigenous peoples to harvest Indigenous foods? How will an income solution ensure that that there's a place to harvest those foods, and that the rights that the Aboriginal rights that we have that are affirmed in the Constitution are protected. If the land isn't healthy, we have some challenges there. So that's really, certainly no one's going to argue that that minimum incomes aren't going to be of benefit. I think really the how that's achieved would be the interesting question to dialogue on further. Okay, so Indigenous perspectives on food. I'm attempting to really take this from a theoretical level, and this is, just part of what's useful in some of the work that I'm currently doing right now as a student. So I have sort of three quotes or three definitions that speak to Indigenous perspectives of food. And Verne in 2015 writes about food being so much more than consumption. So it's not just a single thing that we can try and address. It's not a single problem. Food is something that is it's tied to land. It's tied to our relationships. It's tied to our relationships to the land, to our community, and to health. That it goes beyond choice, and it really has an ability to invoke community well-being and connectedness. And so that's that. When I think of reconciliation, I think of how it brings people together. I think about how it brings people in our communities and our nations together, and I think about how it brings people back to the land and back to the water. And these thoughts and ideas have been noted through time in these other quotes that I've shared. The first settlers who met Indigenous people immediately got the sense that roots and berries and salmon and deer were something quite more than just food. Okay, so and then trying to there's many definitions of food, and I think in health with the World Agricultural Organization, when nutrition was brought into the definition from a health perspective, that was considered a win because it wasn't just enough food. If it's just enough food, then any food will do, but it has to be food that's healthy, and so that's basically the elements there that it's still very much tied to consumption though. So the elements listed in the first column there are really speaking to those pieces that are important from a food justice lens, and it's showing that our definitions that we're forced to use with many of the tools we have to use are rather weak, particularly when you're considering them from an Indigenous perspective. Did include the image from Canada's Food Guide. I think it's probably the most valuable piece of that document because what it did is show that Indigenous people are interacting with food, that that we're actively involved with the land and place, that we're cultivating relationships through harvesting and processing practices. And there's many other roles that we have with the land and the water that are inherently understood within that image. Our roles as caretaker or steward, our roles as harvester, provider, and sharer with our community. The cooks in our community are so important as well. The definition mentions access to land, but access to what? Right now we have problems that exist with respect to ownership and stewardship of land. Recognizing Indigenous nations, currently colonial governments recognize Indigenous nation stakeholders not as decision makers. So this is a place where that food justice piece and where the view of food sovereignty and Indigenous food sovereignty can bring those pieces forward. Some work has been done in Canada's north, where understandably the issue of food insecurity is significant. The impacts of environmental change are probably affecting them, maybe, affecting everyone, but maybe them the most deeply. And to explore, this is a framework, a conceptual framework that was used to pull together an assessment of the state of knowledge with respect to food security within Northern Aboriginal communities. And they pulled this framework together, placing Northern Aboriginal peoples, putting Aboriginal peoples, so the peoples in the middle, the ones who are most strongly impacted, most strongly impacted. That directly outside of that, the influences are the things that are most important from a food security position, are health and resources. Health is, they use the NAHO definition really to recognize that it goes beyond the physical, that health is including social, emotional, and cultural well-being of the community, and also that health extends to the environment, to the land and the wildlife that sustains us. If our land isn't healthy, how healthy can we be? And so that's an important piece. Resources, it speaks to everything that we can draw from the land for our livelihood. So natural resources in the lives of people who have survived the land for generations. It could also mean financial resources. It could also mean the dollars to get the ammunition, the various tools that are required to access food in a modern sense. Culture and rights line up with food sovereignty, and so rights is access. It's a right to food. It's a right to health. Land and harvesting rights are Aboriginal rights, and human rights are both important, along with their linkages to food sovereignty and self-determination regarding food systems and how these all contribute to achieving food security. Culture is the piece where we have, I think we have the most influence, and this is really a model that it lines up most closely with what Indigenous food justice, what those components of food are from an Indigenous perspective are. So culture means the whole way of life. It means our beliefs, our language. Language is so important, and how we live with one another and creation. Relationships with the land, spirituality, behavioral ethics, and families, how we function in our own, our own governing systems as families, as clans, as communities, nations, confederacies. These can all be components of culture, and this is all recognized. Contextual factors, environmental change, the need for intergenerational, the well-being, so that transmission of knowledge between generations, and the knowledge that we prefer to work with, the impacts of colonialism, gender, that women and children are more commonly at risk. I mean, we know that our mothers at risk. So really, the Western view is economics based. It's focused on physical access, and our Indigenous view is much more robust. It's looking at what we can do for all living things for the future. I think the gist of this slide is that at the level of the household, income is a definite driver of our food security, because it influences the balance between accessing the market food system and accessing Indigenous food systems. It takes time for both of those, and often a barrier to Indigenous food is the fact that we're kind of entrenched in this working system, this generating an income for ourselves system, so that we can buy market food. So food security through an Indigenous lens requires the acceptance of and the ability to engage in various multiple roles. Indigenous food sovereignty, really, it's the emphasis on the people in the place, that we have a responsibility to the land systems, and it's one that's achieved by upholding our long-standing sacred responsibilities to nurture healthy, interdependent relationships with the land, the plants, animals that provide us with our food. So it's situated to place. It's how we go about it is going to be specific to place and to the knowledge base of those people who are connected to that area. So looking at food security, on its own, it brings forward the issues of health and resources, which include nutrition and food safety. It's good that food provides us what we need for health, and it's good that it avoids things that are going to create potential illness, as well as availability, access, use, and logistics. A core concept of food sovereignty is about the ability to protect, manage, and control a community's food system and to ensure access to healthy, local, acceptable foods. So food sovereignty starts to bring in the rights discussion into the picture, which includes both human rights and governance. Indigenous food sovereignty adds the fourth leg of the table. So really, Indigenous food sovereignty is going to stand the table up for everyone. Culture, which corresponds to Indigenous knowledge and practice that honors not only the acceptable foods, but also the sacred responsibility. We're in a time and place where everything that we need to feed ourselves within the province is going to be dependent on our full, or all of our ecosystems being as healthy as they can be. In the areas that are fertile, or have been good with agriculture, it's been because of those previous ecosystems that have been nurtured and have been taken care of previously by Indigenous peoples, and those species distinction. So maintaining some of that balance. So food sovereignty, rights and jurisdictional concerns that impact traditional food systems and access to sufficient food requires us to ask the question of whose rights and whose decision-making authority. And if you look at the bubbles there, all of our living things, because they're considered our relatives, the water and all living things in it, the forest, the wildlife, and all the living things, they have rights as well. And that's our Indigenous perspective. So food sovereignty requires us to understand how our current management approaches are fundamentally different from Indigenous approaches. Right now, there's problems with how our ecosystems are managed, and some may say not. They lack balance, and they lack the knowledge of the people from the land. They lack those values of sustainability because they focus on commodities. For example, you look at a forest and you see trees. You don't see all the other elements that are providing food. Within the forest industry, it's that much more that you only actually see specific species of trees that would have some type of economic value. And so elements of that are seen, they're seen in the water with overfishing. They're seen in the views of how we assess environmental change. Depending on what glasses we want to wear, we see the sustainable or the sustenance harvesting of Indigenous people as a cause for decline of a stock, and not any of the development that might have been going on. So what are the tools? I actually really hate this slide because these are colonial tools, and these are colonial views of it. They're long and arduous to work through. They take extensive resources, and they're largely set up to benefit others. Legal cases, there have been definite successes in legal cases, but they take years to bring back limited rights. And so there's many forms. They all just take a lot of energy and a lot of resources to deal with an issue that is speaking to and inequity. Next slide, and this will be my last slide, so I've gone over by 10, I'm sorry. The opportunities, which I always like to see that there's a hope, and that's what the opportunities are. And the opportunities is that the work has been happening in our communities regardless, that increased number of Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples, however you self-identify, are participating in different levels of coordinated harvesting. Maybe that's just based through programming, but there's, those efforts to get youth and elders connected, and those efforts to have people back to the land. Those efforts, those opportunities through action and through learning to bring back the language, the fact that language is in our schools and our languages are in public schools. At the federal level, that Aboriginal traditional knowledge is being incorporated into key assessment processes, which determine species at risk. And so what that means is that they're tapping in to that Indigenous knowledge, which isn't in scientific literature. So a broader, more holistic perspective of the picture is being looked at. Another hope is the dialogue that's happening right now with respect to those current management processes at the provincial level that aren't working. That the dialogue is happening to include Indigenous voice, and that the recommendations are at least being heard, and hopefully it's going to be a lot more than that. That Indigenous people will have a stronger place in the decision level as far as the use of our lands, as well as really pushing for the best possible science that includes the best possible. What I think is best possible is Indigenous knowledge as well. And I'll close with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thank you very much. And Karen, I don't know if you can still hear me. I really appreciate the knowledge. In particular, the back half of this was really enlightening in terms of taking a really specific Indigenous lens to food insecurity. So thank you. Megan, can you hear me?
Okay, so I'm glad you can hear us better, and we're going to have an opportunity to share a little bit about the perspective of the lived experience on Earth. We're going to be leaning into the computer, so I'm not sure how good the video is to be able to see, but yeah. So I wanted to give Daryl a chance again to kind of introduce the topic and what we're going to be chatting about for the next. Okay, so we're going to jump right into it. We only have a few minutes here, so but really, I mean, Daryl and I just wanted to, neither of us work in kind of an academic setting. We're sort of on the ground serving communities. Daryl has lived his whole life in the Chilcotin. He's a member of the Socio-economic Nation and from SLF First Nation, and so knows very well firsthand the experience of food insecurity. So we just wanted to be able to come and provide that perspective alongside the other perspectives. So maybe I'll get Daryl to introduce himself, and then I'll go from there.
Hey, sorry about the microphone thing here, but like Megan said, I'm part of the really into this food security thing because it is so serious, and I'd like to thank everybody for even discussing this.
So Daryl, the picture that I chose of Daryl there for the slide, this is where you can find Daryl pretty well anytime between May 1st and November. Daryl is a really passionate gardener, amongst many other things, but he's also the agriculture coordinator for SLF First Nation, and he wears a few other hats. But Daryl is part and parcel of what's happening in their community right now in terms of land use and planning and agriculture and food security. And on top of all of that, Daryl works with youth and is involved in engaging the youth in all of these issues around food insecurity and providing food and hunting and fishing. So he's extremely humble, so probably wouldn't mention all of the work that he's doing, but he's an absolute pivotal person in Estee Lauder right now in terms of the on-the-ground food insecurity and food security work. And so, did you want to add anything to that?
Very important to this. It can't be mentioned enough. And I got sort of lost in the earlier presentations with the data and what was being presented, which I think was one of the very most inaccurate when it comes to on-reserve situations, when it comes to healthy food. So I really look forward to this going on, and much more studies and work in this very specific field, because it's what's devastating our people as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, so, and we'll get into a little bit more in regards to what's happening at the community level for food insecurity, but it is, you know, when we look at some of the data, and the previous presenters all really did a great job, I think, of acknowledging that the research and the statistics just don't seem to align with the lived experience of food insecurity on reserve. And so when we see some of the numbers, you know, if you go into most First Nations communities in the interior, I think you would find that household food insecurity is much higher than maybe the numbers show. So, but just quickly about myself, I am a dietitian working in Indigenous health. I've worked exclusively with and in First Nations communities for the past 6 or 7 years. I'm of white settler ancestry, and my work with First Nations communities has been really my true education. I have a degree in nutrition, but I don't consider most of my education to have started until I started working with the Korean Dene Nations in northern Saskatchewan. So where we are today, so Daryl and I are in a boardroom in this Socio-economic national government. So we're a tribal agency for 6 communities in the Socio-economic, which is considered kind of broadly the central interior of BC, but that's a huge swath of land. So just to give a little context, we've got a map up on the screen, but we're about, right now we're about 3 hours north of Kamloops. Hey, Daryl, and Daryl came in this morning from Estee Lauder First Nation, which is that purple triangle you see on our map, and it's our most northern community. We also have communities up to 3 or 3.5 hours to the west in the Coast Mountains. So Honeygatine, Seidel-Del, Unisatine, Kutnko, Questco, and Estee Lauder. So as many interior First Nations, our communities are rural and remote, so anywhere from half an hour to 3 hours to the nearest service center. I just wanted to mention that one of maybe the more recognizable Indigenous court cases in the past 10 years or so is the landmark Socio-economic Nation versus British Columbia court case. So that's where the nation was awarded Aboriginal title in 2014. So at this point in time, this nation is the only nation with true, Supreme Court given Aboriginal title to land. So it's a 1,700 square kilometer range, which was essentially awarded by the Supreme Court after 20 years of the nation fighting to prove that was historically occupied by the Socio-economic people and used for foraging and hunting and that sort of thing. So we'll talk a little bit more about Aboriginal title and land later on, I think. Yeah. Did you want to say anything else about the Socio-economic? Yeah, so just like we said, we're gonna kind of zoom in a little bit about that experience of food insecurity on reserve. I think we want to talk a little bit about the historical context, and that's kind of happened a little bit, but I think we're gonna go into that in a little bit more depth. we want to talk about some of the lived experiences, and then at the end, we came up with some approaches to food insecurity that I think haven't been mentioned yet, but really thinking about taking a decolonizing approach to our food insecurity work. So, Daryl. So I'll just introduce us, and then I want Daryl to talk some more about it. We know that at the policy level right now, the conversation is really around income, and the previous presenters did mention the limitations of that. But I think we really want to drill down just on how income measures really will likely be beneficial to some extent, but really aren't getting at those root causes of food insecurity that we see on reserve and that Indigenous people speak about. So we know some of the same factors apply as they apply for off-reserve and non-Indigenous people. If you live in poverty or in rental housing, single parents, when we're receiving social assistance, addictions, and mental health, all of those issues do increase the likelihood that we'll experience food insecurity, and that some of those lived experience is similar in that, if we're living on low incomes, then a lot of that income is going towards buying food and meeting our basic needs. But that income measures really, like I said, aren't going to get down and drill down into some of those root causes of food insecurity. You want to add to that at all?
It's like I said, it's I don't know how much more I could add. We've gone over a lot already, but what I think is it needs more, needs to be dealt with more specifically with the northern region, because there is such a difference in everything that's been talked about or presented, and but this is the very first step, which I'm glad, and I look forward to much more of this and working very hard into solving this problem.
So one thing Daryl mentioned off microphone when we were talking earlier is something that he observed, and I wish that we had more time for Daryl to share more of his story. But Daryl grew up very differently than I suspect most of us, living kind of on the meadows with his grandparents and truly living off the land and following the seasons. And so anyways, his perspective is just so important in how things have changed in a pretty short period of time. But Daryl was mentioning that even since social assistance has reached First Nations communities, food insecurity has worsened.
Very much so. And once again, I'm sorry, it's not picking up everything I'm saying here, but I'm sort of a mumbler, I guess you can say. But Megan, she knows her stuff. She's worked with us for so long. So please acknowledge her fact that she knows what she's talking. And I look very much forward to, like I said, I wish this was more in depth. We had more time. I wish we were like face to face with some of the decision makers out there that can actually help us, which I think is far more important. And that's it for now, I guess.
Okay. So we essentially what we wanted to do in this slide is just kind of paint. Sorry, I'll move the screen back. Paint a picture of Indigenous communities prior to contact, and this is some of us might know this already, but this is a lot of the history of Canada that hasn't been taught in schools and that most Canadians aren't aware of. So if we think about First Nations communities prior to European contact, and obviously this country is large, and so the history of contact varies from East Coast to West Coast to North Coast, but essentially, most communities, people lived subsistence living, people extensively used resources, natural resources, people had communities had a wide-ranging territory. If you compare that to the small reserve systems that we have now, nations shared use lands with neighboring other neighboring nations, and we know that food is really at the center of culture. Every person had that, food procurement skills, hunting, fishing, preserving, drying. But we also know that the environment looked really different, that the air was clean, water was clean, land was clean, there was abundant wildlife. We know that from written records and oral history that people were generally really healthy and robust. We know that diabetes didn't show up in First Nations communities until after the 1960s or so. So compare that to post-contact communities, right? We know that land dispossession happened. Traditional territories, people were moved from their traditional territories onto reserves. The land that communities find themselves on is often less commercially valuable land, marginal. Indigenous land is fragmented and partitioned. Daryl and I talk a lot about this, how you'll look at a map and a community will have sections of land here, there, and everywhere with lots of private land in between, which really impacts how people use land. And then there's lots of natural resource and activity, industrial activity on neighboring lands. Maybe Daryl can mention what his community deals with in terms of industrial activity nearby.
Well, a real good example, there's a Gibraltar mine, which it's a stone's throw away from one of our IRs. That's the proper, and it's pretty much completely devastated our half of our area, and we're still dealing with this problem today. And it's for sure. It's not only that, we're talking another like forestry, everything you can think of. Like bottom line, back in the day, we lived like I tell my boys that we lived like kings. And, like we never had health problems. We followed the food year round. But now we're brought down to sitting in these in third world conditions, which. But I'm glad it's actually being talked about and addressed.
So, that the Mount Poly mine breach happened within 40 kilometers of Esther First Nation, and so the tailings pond breach, the water flowed into the Fraser River right beyond traditional and current modern fishing areas on the Fraser River next to Esther First Nation. To give an example of some of the activity. So climate change was mentioned, but this really, I don't think, can be overstated. Just the reduction in the number of animals, but also the diversity of animals. I talk to elders who say, they can remember almost in one generation where in their territory, there used to be caribou, and then the elk moved in, and then the elk moved out, and then the moose moved in, and now the moose are few and far between and can hardly be found. So that's in one elder's lifetime, how there's drastic changes that have been precipitated by climate change. So, and I think we know those well. We'll talk about fire a little bit more in the next slide. But another issue, or another thing that's contributing to food insecurity, that's a little bit controversial to talk about, but that's something that Daryl and I talk a lot about, and others in community is the movement, or the movement away from subsistence lifestyles to wage labor. So, many people find employment in First Nations communities. There's still high amounts of social assistance, but we know that a lot of people are finding wage labor. But what we hear from people is that really leaves them with not enough time to do the traditional harvesting and gathering and fishing activities. So all of a sudden Western values predominate, where you're working 9 to 5 and punching a clock, and as an elder said, you're following the calendar and not the land. So really that there's a double-edged sort of employment where people are trading their time for money, but then they don't have time to the traditional harvesting activities that they once had. So I think Daryl sees that. Yeah.
And it's so very true. Like, I think it's taken me too long to come to that realization. And I've been in that world. I've done all kinds of work, and if I gave it up to move home and try to revive the food security for our community. And it's cost me a lot to do it, but I feel it's so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Daryl's a perfect example of that, where he's, was making top dollar doing work elsewhere, but then couldn't serve his community and couldn't work alongside people to do those activities and to plant a garden. So, and then this, this could be talked about on its own for the entirety of the morning, but just what, we know about the decrease in knowledge transfer, started with residential schools, removal of children from communities so they're not learning from their parents and grandparents, and then just adoption of Western values over time, which is, kind of the goal of colonialism. So just wanted to mention that, that in 2017, the wildfires that affected this area really highlighted that vulnerability, and has, on one hand, really mobilized some of the resources and people that are getting to work on food insecurity. But, we see communities that there was complete and total road closures. So if you didn't evacuate, you were stuck at home. There was power outages that lasted up to 18 or 20 days. This is an area where people often keep cattle on range, so people lost their cattle, hay fields destroyed. And so anyway, so just and sites lost for picking and wildlife habitat. So I think if food insecurity wasn't an issue before, after the fires, hey Daryl, it was really highlighted that people often have a day or two worth of food in their house at a time. Just the picture on the right, I was just going to say this is from my house in 2017, and you can see those two freezers up front because we had 18 days without power, and so obviously lost all of the food that we had put away as well, and that was the experience of people broadly across this area. Okay. All right. So, and then just some other considerations to mention. In the region that we live and work in, some people travel up to 6 hours to a grocery store. In Daryl's community, it's about half an hour. Is that right? But what happens? What do you see with elders and people that might not have access to a car?
And that's our number one problem, is that very thing. And that's why it sort of lost me with all the earlier talk and the earlier spreadsheets with their data, and that is, I'm not saying it's inaccurate, I have to just say properly, but we need definitely more information, more input, more anything and everything in regards to food security.
Yeah, so a lot of people, spend half of their pension, their old age pension, on gas money just to get to the store to get the groceries in the first place. So access to market foods is a big issue, which kind of goes together with what the previous presenters talked about, this idea of nutrition transition. So people moving away from a traditional diet and reliance on food from the land to predominantly market food, which we know is not as nutrient dense, but then also people have to travel to access. It's not just right in their backyard. So these things come together to really complicate the issue. Did you want to say anything else about that, Daryl?
The very fact that we're reduced to not only travel that far, but when we do get to where we want to go to buy something we want to buy, it's not, like I was told, you get more nutrients out of the wrapper, that whatever you're buying is, you get more nutrients out of the wrapper. So that's what it boils down to. It's very important, and it's something definitely needs to be done. And I look forward to more work in this area.
I know something Daryl often talks about is how upsetting it is to see, people not accessing food from the land, but then going to Walmart to buy processed food and how it kind of tears them up inside. So, and this is all part of the problem, and it's not a moral judgment. It's that these are all of the factors that have come together to contribute to the problem as it exists now. I just mentioned flour and sugar rations from the Canadian government, so I don't know if most people know about this history, but just as First Nations people were moved onto reserves, and particularly in the prairies after the devastation of bison, Canadian government provided flour and sugar rations to Indigenous communities, and that was the first time these foods were introduced, and so we've seen a steady adoption of those kind of ingredients into diets and a resulting decrease in health. Yeah. Okay, so it's difficult to go through these quickly. We'll do our best. But what Daryl and I wanted to talk about is just, I guess, what we're calling decolonizing approaches to Indigenous food insecurity. So maybe some alternative approaches that haven't been discussed so far. I can't tell you how many times I've heard First Nations people say, just give us back our land and we'll look after the rest. So that's why we're starting with the land, and really the importance of resolving land claims and Aboriginal title.
That's exactly it. The decision makers are nowhere near the root of the problem. Yet they're making decisions on behalf of us.
So that ties into this, our second kind of approach, which is meaningful consultation for wildlife management and fisheries decisions. You want to?
Yep. The nation has been dealing with this problem specifically, and it's to the point where we have to step up and do things on our own because it ain't getting nowhere. Like I said, for example, the DFO are making decisions on behalf of us, but yet it's a free-for-all down in the ocean there. But when they come up here, they take the dip nets out of our hands, and it just makes life tough on us, which is the bottom line.
So something that's been happening in this area, and Daryl's community SDLA has been kind of front of the community action, I guess, is basically communities taking power back, even though the power isn't necessarily being given to them. So doing things like banning moose hunts in traditional territories, but also on IR land, as well as closing roads, so shutting down roads that would give hunters access to hunting moose. So this is after lots and lots of supposed consultation that occurs where our leaders aren't being heard when they say that there's decline of moose, there's not enough moose, and we want you as provincial decision makers to shut down the moose hunt. And then the province comes back and says, we consulted with First Nations, but we're still going to issue 200 limited entry moose tags in your territory, even though you're saying that that there's not moose to go around.
We feel like so strong on this point that we actually, our own community has actually, how can you say it?
Gone rogue.
Agreed to do what we wanted to do, and one of the things we did was said we're not going to hunt ourselves, like because of the problems that are out there that need to be heard but are not. So we've taken a bunch of things in our own hands, and like you said, it's a small step, but it's a big step in our minds.
Yeah, so I mean, from my perspective, it's an absolute travesty that people living in SDLA First Nation, for example, that just Daryl gave, that subsist on the land. Many people that don't have much for income and experience food insecurity are saying, we're so concerned about this moose problem that we're not going to hunt. But then the province still issues tags for people to hunt moose in the territory where most of those tags are people from out of country or out of province that come in and kind of trophy hunt. And so, it's from the community's perspective, it really reads like, the province wants to take money for those tags and wants to collect those revenues, but doesn't care about the food insecurity of people living in the community.
Yeah, it's the same problem with the salmon thing, like what I mentioned earlier. The very same thing. Bottom line is we like I said, we're taking our own steps to deal with these problems, but which someday will be heard throughout the world.
Yeah, so in the interim, that's what First Nations communities are kind of, their hand is being forced. Okay, so the other thing we wanted to mention is just the incredible importance of wherever we can to reduce barriers to First Nations people being able to access traditional foods when they're in public facilities or public settings. So whether it's schools, hospitals, long-term care facilities. So we know that colonial laws and regulations make it really hard for First Nations people to access their traditional foods outside of their communities, and we've talked about even the issues there. But as soon as you set foot into a public setting, you can't access the foods that sustain you and nourish you. So we know that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said that to deny one's food is to deny them their culture, and so that's essentially what these laws and regulations are saying to First Nations people when they're in a long-term care facility where they might spend the last 5 years of their life, that you can't access your foods and therefore you can't access your culture.
And the very fact that the introduced diet is which resulted in them being where they are now, like in these hospitals, in these poor health conditions, undernourished, this and that, for the very fact that they can't go out into their own land and take care of themselves. And now that they're in the spot where they are, where I feel it's needed the most is this kind of food that they've been relying on all their lives, and yet it's what's the proper word?
They're denied.
Yeah, denied to access that food, which believe me, they're really wanting and wishing for, and hopefully this gets moved forward. This especially is one of the leading concerns and topics that Megan and I have gone over more than once.
So I was just going to point to the work of, if people don't know about the work that's being done by the Nourish Healthcare Project, they're looking at this issue on a national scale and trying to develop tools to for people like us to work with, to try to work with our local public institutions to get those foods onto the menu in schools and long-term care facilities and hospitals. So our nation is working with our local health region, Interior Health, on a project called Forest to Fork that's essentially looking at this very issue. We've been mired in all kinds of red tape, and that's where we are now. So we're looking at the moment, we're waiting on a legislative exemption to be able to allow us to serve about 5 elders in a long-term care facility some traditional foods from the land. So it's been about 1.5 years to get to that point, and we're still not there. That's a challenge. So then just some other things we wanted to mention, we're almost done here, but just the real critical importance of getting youth on the land and just really embedding those cultural activities right into the school curriculum from the start, whether on reserve schools or not.
And it's like we've talked about this more than once, like I said, and getting youth involved in this. I think education is sort of the trick, rather than handouts or like things that seem to make no sense is what we're being dealt. And through all these studies and interactions and communications, we're missing the main things, which is educating our youth and going back to the traditional ways and the traditional diets, and which is number one cause of even this whole thing being brought up with Megan and I is for the future of our peoples and especially the unreserved underserved peoples.
Yeah, so it would be amazing to give Daryl an opportunity someday to just talk about the work he does with youth, because he's changing youth lives just by connecting them to the land and to food. So knowledge transfer project, this is something we just wanted to mention because there's this just incredibly critical need to really capture elders' knowledge right now. We know that there's elders still living that have subsisted on the land prior to some of these colonial policies, and every time one of these elders dies, we lose that knowledge. And I just think that it's one of the most important things that we can do is just find a way to capture that knowledge. But unfortunately, the colonial legacy means that many elders don't trust traditional, or I guess, Western ways of documenting that knowledge. And so that's the real challenge in our work is finding out how do we capture elder knowledge outside of recording or writing things down.
Next to the youth, the elder thing is just as important, but it really affects our community, especially because we are a very small community, and we through poor lifestyles, poor diet, all these things added together, where we have little to no elders left in our community. That's how serious this is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's critical. The last thing we were going to mention, which is, it's funny that this is the last thing and we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but because this is something Daryl and I work together on a lot, which is Indigenous agriculture project. So this is food production alongside creating jobs in communities and revenues for bands, which ties into Indigenous sovereignty and all of that. But really, I guess what we wanted to say is for anybody that has the opportunity to work with First Nations communities on agriculture projects, just the real critical importance of focusing on building community capacity for these projects. So rather than what has happened kind of in the past, which is a lot of reliance on external experts, external consultants, really spending the time to build that foundation of that knowledge in communities, so that communities aren't forever kind of tied to that those external experts and consultants. If that makes sense.
That's so. It's exactly what we're trying to get away from. Is all these solutions, everything you can think of, only it doesn't go beyond the fact that when the consultants or the people that are studying or helping or whatever leaves, and then there's not enough knowledge being passed down to the community level, which is a real thing that's I think that's holding us down to where we are, is that very fact that there's people there just to, sure, in theory or in the reports, they're doing the job, they're helping us, this and that, but when it comes right down to it, they're far from doing that. They're pretty much just securing a job and leaving, and then we're left with, if not worse shape than when they first came. Mm-hmm. So that's our number one goal now, is to get away from that, and that's what we're going to do.
So just a quick example of the way that SDLA is doing that. They're connected in with the local university here, and they're tied into a project that's looking at regenerating some of their pasture lands, but also teaching community members the skill set that they need to manage that land. So rather than sending in a consultant and getting a report, they're going to be engaged and actually taking courses at the university to learn how to manage the land. And so that's all we had for you. We've gone way over time. Just leaving you with this image of Elder Dorothy Myers working a commercial greenhouse that was in Unisatine Stone Indian Band last year, self-funded project. There's no grant money involved whatsoever, and they've got 3 large commercial greenhouses where they're producing food for their communities and market. So just to leave us on a bit of a positive note. I don't know if we have time for questions or not. I'll leave it to the facilitators.
I just wanted to take a quick moment to circle back to a few of the things. I know Ada was talking a lot about specific examples towards Head Start programs and that sort of thing. While we don't have as much time to dive into that today, I'd invite anybody that's still listening, that's interested in those sorts of things, to tune in on Thursday. We're going to be talking a lot about programs of that nature and what those look like in a community level and how those are implemented. So today's conversation was really just setting the groundwork for a lot of what we're going to talk about on Thursday. Daryl, Megan, I want to thank you very much for your time. I really appreciated it, particularly the knowledge around the projects you have going on. They seem numerous and fantastic. We'd love to get in contact with that. You can tune in on Thursday to address that question. You can tune in on Thursday by visiting our website. There you'll see the session for Thursday, November 22nd. You can register for that webinar in the same way that you did for this one. I appreciate all of your feedback and all of your questions and comments. Everybody was very engaged and invigorated by the conversation today, and I think as facilitators, that's all we can really ask for. So just know that all of your comments are noted and will be taken into consideration. Do we have any closing comments? Melanie, Kathleen?
Just thank you all for all the comments and for all the considerations. Thank you.
And I think for me as well, reading the comments, they all make sense. And I just was really sort of setting up the stage and want to acknowledge, that the knowledge that Suzanne and Daryl and Megan brought. And I really don't call myself an expert in this, so I'm sorry if that came across as the first speaker. And I'm learning from all the comments, and this is a process for me. So thank you for the comments, and I'm going to take them seriously as well.
Awesome. So sorry for being so late. Thank you very much for sticking with us till the end. Until next time. Bye.
Thank you.